Thank you so much for coming out on this cold, foggy day. And we're really happy to have you talk about to have you here at this talk that we are going to do, which is basically to understand, which is actually contradictory because Trump is often very unpredictable, but we are going to try to predict maybe what Trump to uh, can have in his term as president for the next 4 years. This basically came about because Shayak said that he was doing a, a visit in New Delhi, and we thought that as he's coming all the way from there, it would be interesting for us to put together a panel of people at C- CSEP and as well as who are associated with us to kind of give some hot takes on what the next 4 years will look like. Um, and we want this to be more of a informal conversation, just trying to see what their thoughts are on very specific sectors. So as we know, I- India and US relations span so many things. I mean, there's a conversation about advanced artificial intelligence chips, to oil sanctions, to Bangladesh, to the Adani case, and we can go on and on. But what we thought is that we would get four sectoral experts who can really speak about things that are important, such as trade, climate, the always the big elephant in the room, China, and our neighborhood. So with that, I will go on to give them the stage, and we have with us Shayak Sengupta, who was actually a visiting researcher at CSEP a few years ago when he was doing his PhD, but is now leading the India work at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Thank you for coming all the way here. And then we have with us Amita Batra. I don't think I need to say much about her. She was on the Prince intellectual list, the the top next thinkers to think about in for the next decade. So that's the next 10 years of hard work, Amita. uh, yeah, I said that. Then we have Jabin Jacob, who is our China whisperer. So, so we go to him anytime there's anything going on about China. He is the go-to person. Make sure that oh 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 yeah, of course. Um, and he is at Shiv Narad University, but also a non-resident with us. And make sure you look out for his op-eds, which he's always writing, and keeping us on our toes about China. And of course, last but not the least, our Constantino Xavier, who without whom all this would not really be happening, who leads the foreign policy team at CSEP, and make sure that we all are having these really interesting conversations. And with that, I will give it to Riya Sinha, who will be leading this conversation. Thank you so much.
Uh, Thank you, Pooja, and I'm delighted to see a full house at CSEP today. It's been a while, and perhaps this is no. I mean, with more than 200 registrations. So, I mean, thank you for joining us today for this discussion. So this conversation will be a mix of moderated discussion followed by question and answers from the audience. I will pose 2 rounds of questions to our panel, focusing on identifying the risks and opportunities associated with Trump 2.0 in 4 sectors: energy and climate policy, trade, relations with China, and India's neighborhood. I'll request our panelists to keep the remarks 3 to 4 minutes at each session so that we can have the last 35 minutes for question and answers with the audience. With that, let me start with the first round where we focus on the risk associated with India's with Trump 2.0 and how do we foresee India responding to that. So Shayak, if I may start with you, you co-authored the chapter in CSEP's report, Tracks to Transition, on India's climate engagement with the US, where you focused on shared commitment on energy and climate priorities. Now we know President-elect Trump is well known for his climate skepticism, and perhaps climate cooperation will not be an area of priority between India and the US. What sort of challenge does this pose for India's own 2030 decarbonization target?
So thank you. Thank you to CSEP for having me and hosting me. It's wonderful to be back. I think there are kind of two main risks that I see with Trump coming back. Of course, he is no stranger, or no stranger to him being a skeptic of climate. We won't really see the word climate or clean energy anywhere in relations with India for the next 4 years. And that's very obvious. But when you mentioned the chapter I co-authored for that report, one thing we found actually though during the Trump administration, a lot of this cooperation, especially at the working and lower levels of government and climate, and they span technical assistance, development projects, small amounts of finance here and there. They kept going. They just were rebranded, reframed as energy security or development, or under different things. But what we did see is a lack of ambition at the highest levels. You will never see a White House or a prime minister's office kind of coming together and addressing climate over the next 4 years, unfortunately. That being said, during Trump 1.0, India was really the one kind of propping up the climate relationship with the United States. I don't see that changing, especially with 2030 targets. India's set full force ahead. If anything, I think, when we have that transition from Trump to Biden, India had the experience of dealing with other G7 countries who could offer many other things when it comes to climate and energy that the United States, frankly, couldn't during Trump and even during the Biden administration can. I think specifically we could see a lot of a shifting away from the United States government has about $1 billion in solar manufacturing in India for 2 to 3 projects. It's still uncertain if those projects will continue, but more investments in other areas of clean energy manufacturing as an alternative to China. Whether those will continue, there might be, but again, with Trump, it's kind of uncertain. I think another risk is really, and this is outside clean energy, is constraining India's own energy imports, and that can happen in 2 ways. One is sanctions on Russian oil. So the Biden administration recently sanctioned a great number of oil tankers and what we call the shadow fleet of how India has been importing Russian oil that's been above a price cap that the G7 has kind of multilaterally once themselves have set. But this is uncertain enough to spook Indian refiners to say potentially that we're not going to take any more Russian oil going forward. In addition to that, there's also this idea of quid pro quo. There was some evidence during the first Trump administration that India bought more cargoes of US LNG and oil for geopolitical, leverage, or however you want to say it. Of course, we can't find very explicit evidence of that, but knowing Trump, that is also a possibility. Again, constraining how India can go about importing this energy, and especially in conflict.
India will have to do a lot of heavy lifting within this sector.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's market based, right? There's only so much that any government can do with fossil fuel trade. Again, Russian oil sanctions are a good example of what they can do, especially for the United States. But at the end of the day, it's US private sellers of oil and gas. You have some PSUs here on the Indian side, but unless there's a supply and a demand, there's only so much you can do to kind of force uneconomical purchases of oil and gas to satisfy geopolitical objectives.
Thank you, Shayak. Professor Batra, if I may come to you next now. Trump, in his own words, is a big believer in tariffs. He's already threatened Mexico, Canada, China, and has also singled out India and Brazil in terms of imposing higher tariffs on American goods. Trump 1.0 we did see a lot of, even though there were economic tensions, it was hand in hand with growing strategic ties. Do you see this trend continuing in Trump 2.0 in terms of the tariff tensions?
Two things, thank you first, of course, for to CSEP for having invited me today. For me, having been here about 10 days back, I feel I'm still here, very much like it's home for me. So coming to the subject, I think as far as tariffs are concerned, more than tariffs, I think I see two implications of Trump's statements so far. When he says tariffs are going to be imposed, I think that's a now commonly known, that he uses tariffs in a transactional manner. He has been saying that he would impose 100%, 60%, 20%, 10%, and so on, How much he will actually impose is a different question altogether, Yes, tariffs are going to be weaponized and they're going to be used as an instrument to transact probably trade or even other business as far as Trump is concerned. More importantly, what I see these indicative of, that is when he says tariffs against possibly India, also Mexico, also Canada. The fact that he's not going to leave his allies out of this kind of a transactional approach, where tariffs can be weaponized or can be used as weapons even against those who are a part of institutional arrangements, I think gives us two indications. One, that nobody can think that they have an easy pass as far as Trump is concerned. You may say that we've been on great terms with Trump. We have this easy relationship with the United States, you see, but how Trump views that at a particular point of time, I think is a different question altogether that one has to yet be able to decipher. It's very difficult to do that, Two, when we say Mexico and Canada, there is a question mark then on the institutional arrangements, I feel. I mean, his tendency even to probably unravel some of the institutions that he himself was at the helm of, constituting. The transition from NAFTA to USMCA happened when Trump was there. And USMCA is United States, Mexico, Canada. USMCA moving forward as far as Biden is concerned was then, you had the legislation of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that brought in different kinds of rules of origin for the USMCA partners as well as the FTA partners of North America, in particular the US. So in that context, you see, when you start to challenge both Mexico and Canada, you're also challenging some of the legislations that have been put in place in order to consolidate these institutional arrangements and to consolidate the regional value chains, intensification of trade within. So if you have that kind of an attitude where there is no respect for either institutions or for trade norms, earlier it was just trade norms, global trade norms, the WTO, tariffs are going to be used bilaterally instead of multilateral norms, etc. Now it's also institutions which he himself has been, he himself has helped institutionalize, those relationships. So if that is involved, in terms of unraveling of existing institutions, I think India has to be very cautiously approaching the Trump 2.0 in terms of looking for alternatives that will help it diversify the increasing amount of risk that is going to be forthcoming, So as I see it, I think you have to look for stability. Stability in this kind of an atmosphere comes from risk diversification. When we talk about risk diversification, we should really be looking at alternative trade forums where India can participate, And I generally identify, not generally, but I think specifically identify three formulations here. You have the IPEF, that is the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. You have the RCEP and you have the CPTPP, as alternatives to what is going on. We know North America is already discriminatory. Trump is probably going to make it even more. European Union with the CBAM will also make it more and more intensification of trade within the EU. What we see, therefore, is these as alternatives, IPEF, in the sense, we are not a part of the trade pillar as it is. Whether IPEF will continue or not it has an existential, there's a question mark on that, you see, because Trump during his campaign was very, very clear about knocking it off once he comes into, assumes office, So whether IPEF will survive or not is one question. Two, India is not part of the trade pillar. Three, I have my huge reservations as far as the supply chain agreement under IPEF is concerned. I can go into details in the next round, but that itself it doesn't make none of the provisions as far as the supply chain agreement is concerned are really mandatory in terms of fulfillment as far as members are concerned, unlike any of the FTAs, So a lot of those are basically voluntary disclosure of information that is required as per the supply chain agreement. Voluntary is voluntary at the end of the day, That is the second part. You see, that is the first part as far as institutions or alternative institutions are concerned. As far as RCEP is concerned, I think we are very clear or very emphatic, you see, that we do not want to join the RCEP. There are opportunities within RCEP in terms of what I say fundamental, the common cumulative rules of origin that make it easier for us to be part of global supply chains, The third would be CPTPP, where I see the maximum possibility, maximum option as far as India is concerned, and it being the most ambitious as far as the trade formulation is concerned, probably being the best opportunity for India to, at this time, think of start preparing, at least put in its application towards CPTPP, So I see these as possibilities or avenues of risk diversification for India in a situation where broadly we anticipate increased amount of instability and risk and disruption.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Jacob, if I may come to you next. Now, no conversation about Trump 2.0 is complete without talking about the dragon in the room, which is China. And many analysts have argued that, they expect a strong security posture under Trump 2.0, especially in partnership with like-minded countries like India. Given the recent India-China disengagement, what risk do you foresee for India-China relations and the broader regional dynamics under Trump 2.0?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you. I see in this room both my first boss and one of my students, plus all my quite a few from my university as well. So it's quite special, this particular occasion. And but to talk about, the questions that you raised, Riya, that's going to be a little harder. I'm going to sort of riff off from what Professor Batra was just saying, that one of the risks I see is that Trump 2.0 could undo some of what Trump 1.0 did as far as China policy is concerned. You have to give due where it's, to Trump 1.0 for actually changing the course of America's China policy. There was a lot of talk for years and years about what China was doing, how China was taking advantage of the American system, American openness, but it took until Trump to actually make that switch effective in terms of policy. And that is where I think India and the United States actually sort of aligned better on China. But, in the first Trump administration, the Republican Party was still around. So we had structures in place, we had systems in place where even though the top echelon was, well, broadly concerned about China, they were also professional enough to leave the experts come up with policies on China. So we had smart people like Pottinger, for example, in the NSA who sort of drove China policy. In the current Trump administration, I'm not sure that's the case. I'm not sure that MAGA Republicans, the Republican Party itself has changed. Structure, the people, the systems that send smart people into administration or knowledgeable people into administration, I'm not sure that is clear. We have very obviously anti-China focus in some of the picks of the new Trump administration, but whether they will stick with policy or be constrained by Trump's tendency to strike a deal or be constrained by their loyalty to Trump rather than to process and to systems, I think that can impact China policy as it will, I think, impact all policies, trade or whatever. So that is one concern, and that is where I think in India we must be concerned about, well, certain glib statements, shall we say, about us being able to work with the new Trump administration. That might not necessarily be the case on China policy if there isn't depth or seriousness with respect to dealing with China, 24/7, round the clock. So that's the first risk. The second risk is, again, the whether the United States under Trump 2.0 will simply blow up the international order or multilateralism or international law as we know it. And this is an opportunity for China because if Trump targets the international order as it stands, international law, including, and this is very useful for China in two ways. One, China can push the argument that it has been pushing for a very long time, that the international system, international institutions, international law as it stands is faulty, is problematic. And it doesn't say it's problematic. I mean, while rhetorically it says it's problematic for the global South, in effect, it's problematic. In practice, it says it's problematic because, say, on South China Sea, it wants to ignore the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. So it's on very particular areas that it says it's problematic. And this is something that the Chinese will take advantage of. Second, it's a propaganda victory for the Chinese because anything that Trump does is going to be seen as irresponsible. And China has an opportunity by default to look better by saying, oh, look, we are a responsible power. And, a few strategically timed statements to make it look like China, is a better, more reasonable power. And when China creates the impression of being more reasonable than Trump, that's even more bargaining power, leverage as far as China is concerned, whether with the BRI or any of its spin-offs, the Global Development Initiative. And I don't think the Americans have really cottoned on to the seriousness of initiatives like the Global Civilization Initiative, the Development Initiative. I mean, the Security Initiative, everybody, because of the name, everybody is concerned. But the Development Initiative and the Civilization Initiative are also serious affairs because these are political and ideological platforms or strategies, which we have to fight on the basis of political and ideological, standpoints. It's not simply a Chinese project that, you can think is like any normal Chinese foreign policy initiative. There's a very strong political approach here. And I think in that sense, the Trump administration, I'm not entirely certain that they quite get this aspect. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Professor Jacob. Constantino, to borrow from Professor Jacob, if China is seen more responsible than the US, particularly in India's neighborhood, what kind of challenge does it put? With Biden, we saw that there was a lot more outreach to the neighborhood with Nepal, with Maldives, with Bhutan. 50 million additional was given to Nepal as part of the MCC. There are expectations that many of these initiatives may be pulled back. And if China is seen as more responsible than Trump 2.0, where does that leave India's relations in the neighborhood? What are the risks for India in the neighborhood?
Thanks, Riya. I think I just qualified the if. I think it already is becoming increasingly seen as more responsible, China, right? I mean, that's the perception we have from our surveys in the neighborhood. If you talk to people in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, the Chinese are portrayed often, right? Mostly, majoritarily as a benign partner, as an ever-giving partner. India is seen as a troublemaker often. The Americans are seen as trying to contain China and playing geopolitical games. I mean, if you speak to most decision makers today in the smaller countries of Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean region, Africa, it seems like the only countries that have cynic interests, it's the US mostly, in this case with Trump, probably irresponsible interests. And that the only country that somehow is devoid of any cynic interests and is just an altruistic partner, the People's Republic of China. With that, to your point, that will become more of an issue. Agreed? And let me run you to two risks I was thinking of that will fall on India's lap, if you want. And again, my caveat is if you believe that India is a regional power that can shape this region at its own will, at its own capacity, that can do whatever it wants, should do it in isolation, does not need partners, then you will disagree with me. Because then you believe in, of course, I think an ideal chimerical world that is just not true, right? India today has realized, in fact, the last 20 years has been working with a variety of partners, whether it's the United States, Russia, France, Japan, just to talk of 4, Australia, if you want 5 countries, the EU beginning to do this with the EIB, to shape the growth and security prospects of India's periphery. So today you have India and Bangladesh, for example, developing a nuclear power reactor in Bangladesh, right? India and Russia doing that together. You have, like you mentioned, Riya, the US putting in grants of what, $1 billion in Nepal and in Sri Lanka, 500 million each approximately, to support connectivity, power, and ports with India. That's what the US is doing, right? So your question is, I mean, how if you believe that this is redundant or useless, then okay, we're great. India will do all of this alone. I think it's going to be very difficult. So that's my main risk. The first risk is that this region is going through tremendous turbulence, and I think we haven't even seen of what is about to hit us over the next few years in this region. And I think 2 examples of this, whether they're positive or negative, but turbulence is change and is always a risk. One is the first massive financial default in an Asian economy since 1997, which is Sri Lanka, which India had to support, which India took a leadership on to reset that country. It is still supporting that country. It took the first response up to $3 billion worth in assistance that that India granted in different forms of support to Sri Lanka. The second one is Myanmar, which is a neighbor of India, 1,600 kilometers long border. It is a country that is close to anarchy, where the Burmese army controls less than 1/3 of the territory of the country, where most areas on bordering India are in total collapse or in the hands of insurgent groups. Third example of massive churning and collapse, if you want, collapse may not be churning, Bangladesh. It is going through a massive change. The indicators of growth in Bangladesh for the last quarter are negative. The prospects of any elections for the next 2-3 years are negative. We're talking now about army factions in Bangladesh. Forget the whole minority issue, etc. Also an issue, by the way, but there's a tremendous turbulence in the 8th largest country of the world, Bangladesh, next door, right, which has one of the longest boundaries in the world with India. So with that sense, on 2 aspects, there'll be a risk. Trump will, again, if you think India can take care of this alone, this will be welcome. My expectation is the Trump administration will say, let India deal with its neighborhood, politically and security-wise. This is India's turf. He loves spheres of influence. He respects, he understands spheres of influence, unlike many in the Biden administration. And therefore, my guess is he will delegate this to India if there are issues. Now, this is actually, people will say this is great. This is a risk. And I think most decision makers in Delhi are realizing the pains of having to deal with a US that will not be part of the collaborative governance systems that are going to regulate the political and security architecture in India's periphery. Risk number 1. Risk number 2 is the public goods economic developmental agenda. Trump, for example, IMEC, India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, which was announced at the G20 summit here in Delhi. Again, if you think that India can provide alone the public goods, the growth, the economic assistance, these developmental solutions on energy, for example, on trade, on investments for the countries in the periphery, if it can do it alone, you will take exception with what I'm going to say. But I think most of us realize that this will have to be a collaborative instrument and that the US is going to scale back massively on what has been done since the 2000s. Took a little bit of a slowdown in Trump 1, and I think will become even more of a slowdown in Trump 2, which is instruments like the Quad being a public good provider on clean tech, clean energy, technology, ORAN, telecommunication systems, standardization in harmonization across countries. By the way, also aid. I mentioned the $1 billion that are not coming from anywhere. They're coming from the DFC, private sector mobilized by the state in Sri Lanka to develop one of the container terminals. And the USAID system under MCC in Nepal, $550 million for a power transmission line, and to re-regulate the entire Nepal electricity system that after 40, 50 years of constant neglect, finally is going to deliver developmental solutions for India in terms of exporting, importing with India. So that's risk number two. I don't see the US and under Trump playing game in terms of we will take a public goods agenda to Asia. He will have a mercantilist approach, which is what is in it for our companies on IMEC, for example. That does not mean that some of these projects will not happen, but there will be a very different White House talking to India about these things.
Thank you. To start the next round on opportunities, I'm going to reverse your first point in terms of saying what could be the opportunities of that. Under Trump 1.0, we saw that there was alignment, especially on the Indo-Pacific policy. Under Trump 2.0, that's expected to continue. So in terms of delegating, say, the regional work, the Indian Ocean work, South Asia engagement to India, what sort of opportunities can India extract from this, given the risk that you highlighted?
I mean, I think this is an opportunity for India, as you mentioned, and it's interchangeable, this question. I see an opportunity for India to take the lead on a variety of issues. But let me give you maybe another sense of why I think there's an opportunity for India, or what India will benefit from. By disengaging, Trump will send signals across the Indo-Pacific saying, you guys take care of your own security. Japan, Europeans, French, Southeast Asians. He's not going to go into collective security mechanisms of ASEAN and support that. He's going to disengage. You guys take care of your political and security architectures. You beef up your defense budgets. You protect yourself. We do not want to be called to protect anyone. We've heard this in Trump 1. It's going to escalate under Trump 2. What does this mean for India in particular? Actually a good thing. What does it mean? It means that the Europeans, whether it's the EU, whether it's idea of a pivot to the Indo-Pacific, defense partnerships with India, being a more geopolitical commission, whether it's France, which has been playing a very important role in the Indo-Pacific already with India, whether it's Japan, which is normalizing from a defense and security perspective in the last few decades, whether it's the Australians who are showing up in South Asia to play also a game of security and supporting India in shaping the Indian Ocean governance systems, whether it's also Russia, by the way, which will also have a space. So all these countries will see this as an incentive to start working with India in shaping the Indo-Pacific from a political perspective. Instead of looking at DC and expecting that the bilateral relationship with DC will have a buy-in in the Indo-Pacific, these countries, I expect, will read Trump's signals as we have to engage India much more in shaping the Indo-Pacific. That will therefore lead to what we saw in 2016, which is the architecture of middle powers developing systems. The India-France-Australia relationship, rest in peace, remember 2016, right, on maritime security, developed under Trump. But the India-France relationship also developed under Trump precisely because of those reasons. So expect many more of these middle powers, and that puts again an onus on many of these countries to work with India because they'll have to find new ways to work with India on maritime security, on cyber, on space, on a variety of different new security elements.
Thank you, Tino. Professor Jacob, on that, from the neighborhood and to bringing in a more regional dynamic with the US-China rivalry expected to intensify, are there opportunities that India can leverage on from this, especially in terms of strategic positioning?
Look, I mean, the US-China rivalry has been intensifying for the last decade now. And the answer to the question really is if how we assess whether we have actually taken advantage of this in the last decade. And my sense is, yes, broadly, India has taken advantage of the intensification of US-China rivalry. But the reason why some initiatives go under a tombstone saying RIP in India is because of a lack of capacity on our side. I mean, we can have all the opportunities out there, but I don't think we are in a position to exploit all of them because we severely lack capacity. I mean, Amita just mentioned that India should at least put in an application to the CPTPP. It's quite a mouthful. But you know, how many people are actually thinking about it within the system? And if we were to sort of put in an application, how we expect to deal with industry naysayers. All of those things we need to actually sort of work on, and I don't see the debate in public right now. And this is partly the problem that this is always in the realm of grand strategy. And in a few rooms like these, but these need to be out in the public domain. We need more voices coming in, talking to us. Telling the government, look, these are the possibilities. Let's think a few of these things through. Let's act on some of this. So, and the point that Tino made about, Trump being happy to give South Asia off as a sphere of influence to India, and that's, the Chinese are going to sit back, right? Look, if we see an opportunity, the Chinese also see an opportunity. And so my sense is that if the Americans do anything like that, the Chinese are going to push even harder, make life even harder and more difficult for us in South Asia. Which is maybe a good thing. History has proven that unless the Chinese are sitting on your border, we will not, push on border infrastructure development. We will
Military
not,
reforms.
or military reforms. And even then, by the way, despite all of this, we still haven't got theaterization in the Indian Armed Forces after all this talk. So, I am a little concerned about that. You talked about an opportunity, but I feel like if you talk and overplay an opportunity or a simple risk opportunity dyad, I don't think that really sort of helps. The other thing is, if Trump goes with a tariff plan against China, how are we in a position to actually exploit it? Whatever affects China will also affect India. So I'm not certain that, again, while we can crow about, well, Trump and coming and making life harder for China, whether we are actually in a position, I'm not entirely certain that we are in a position to exploit this advantage. Even on ISET, I have a sense that the momentum has sort of dropped on this score. So
Perhaps the opportunity is capacity building.
yeah, but that's on us,
Inwards.
isn't it? We are not going to, capacity building is on the Indian government and on Indian systems, Indian universities, Indian think tanks. We can't be depending on the Americans for that. And we shouldn't be talking about this in anticipation of Trump. We should have been talking about it about 4 years ago, right? The moment Trump didn't win a second term, we should have started thinking about it. So, yeah, that's, it's not much of an opportunity case there, right?
It sounds good.
It doesn't sound like it. Yeah. So, yeah.
But I agree. I'm glad you pushed it above. You're going to a political jungle, right? And I see a lot of optimism in Delhi saying, we're talking about this, the Chinese love this, the black and white of Trump. This is something we like. It's transactional, it's mercantilist. We can find deals. And it did India well during Trump 1, to be fair. But this is going to be it's going to be a even denser, darker jungle, right? On immigration, by the way, for example, on defense and security. And I think, therefore, you need to navigate this. And that means state capacity to, for example, what I was saying, equip the neighborhood, deal with Bangladesh, right? Shape the governance in your immediate periphery. We're not talking about a place in another continent. We're talking about a place that is 2 hours flight from here. Right? Countries that are on the verge of collapsing, going through massive political, social, and economic churning. So, yeah, state capacity, and not only state, social capacity also said, right? Larger civil society capacity and research ecosystems, they're going to.
That's another 2-hour discussion or just on capacity, but thank you for bringing that, Professor Batra. Just continuing the capacity conversation though, you mentioned RCEP and CPP, given existing what India has right now, and you did argue that in an article recently that India must develop a trade strategy to leverage the US-China trade and tech competition. Could you elaborate on the specific areas? You did mention 2 of these, but where else does the opportunity lie?
First, my differences with what has been said so far. I think one statement that Tino makes, in terms of China being considered a benign player in the region, I would differ from that, because yes, the countries choose to deal with China or the smaller nations. They see an advantage in that, but the advantage is more in terms of using that as a bargaining power, it's a country with deeper pockets, India cannot match that. Yes, the smaller countries know that, but they also know where India is, and the centrality of India and the critical importance of that in South Asia, which cannot be done away with, and the long history that India's placement in the region has, So I think one needs to be able to distinguish between how China has come to be perceived in recent times with its capital. Taking that a bit forward in terms of capital itself, when we look at Sri Lanka, the example that has just been given, I think I would again here point out that one needs to realize that the entire delay in the debt restructuring that happened as far as Sri Lanka is concerned at the middle of its crisis, or when it was deepest in its crisis, was because of China. And the kind of terms that China has in terms of lending, the commercial terms, the high rates of interest, the higher rates of return that it asks for, not being a part of the Paris Club, not wanting to be equated in terms of commercial, lenders. All of that was a big, big problem. Yes, India did step in. India's G20 presidency helped in bringing about everybody around the table to set up, I think, a grouping or something that was set up, finally. But one has to realize where China was in that context, how it changed the context because of the nature of debt that Sri Lanka had. So in that sense, any country really thinking that China is a benign partner, I think I would have my doubts about that, The second thing, when you talk about, I think I would agree with what Professor Jacob has said, in terms of China and our perception of thinking about this being a complete advantage for India. I think you have to see it in the context of as the context is evolving. Things are changing by the day as far as Trump is concerned. Unpredictability is the second name as far as Trump is concerned, Trump has invited President Xi Jinping, to his oath-taking ceremony, friendly overture in that sense, He's already stated the two of us can get together to resolve many problems in the world, Another friendly overture, So what is the kind of relationship that Trump is looking for? What is the kind of transactions that he's trying to build? I think one has to be very careful about that in terms of making an assessment of that, Two, China has its own very strong, I would say, weapons, in terms of critical minerals, Yes, Trump is talking about territorial acquisitions as far as Greenland is concerned, partly because of its critical minerals. There is already a talk about, it being formalized in some of the other form. Republicans are in the process of doing that. But I think China has the capability and the capacity to process critical minerals like nobody else. And that export is a huge amount of power as far as China is concerned. Nobody is in the current state of affairs. I don't think the US is in a state to be able to really, have a contentious path along that particular sector, That's the second bit that I might want to, kind of point out, The third, when we talk about advantage, I think, again, agreement with Professor Jacob when he says that India doesn't have the capability. My question to, I would go a little deeper into that and say, that where is the advantage? It's easier said than actually what happens in the real world, We think that investment is going to move away from China. India is an attractive proposition. We think that a lot of rerouting that is happening from China to ASEAN will be, there will be tariff hikes against that, and India can take an advantage. Capability is one question, whether India has the ability to really attract that investment. We've done a lot. Yes, we are attractive, but there is a lot that remains to be done, and there is a lot of competition. But my fundamental question here is, how far can any country go in levying tariffs against China? Do not forget the fact that China is at the center of all global value chains. It continues to be so. And the dense, the network of these supply chains is so dense that even those who sit at the headquarters of all of these production, large multinational corporations have no idea about how far it spreads and how densely it spreads where. So to unravel it all and to think that this investment is just going to be lifted out of China and be placed in India and we should prepare for it or we have an advantage there, I have my doubts, and I say this also on the basis of the fact, you see, that in Trump 1.0, when tariffs were being hiked in vis-a-vis China, or when the steel and aluminum tariffs were hiked to begin with, there were countries that did deals. In the Korea-US FTA, Korea was able to make a deal with the United States for products so as to be able to sell steel to it, What would it buy from the US at concessional rates? What would it take for Koreans to be able to sell steel to the US, even though tariffs had been hiked for the rest of the world? Under the preferential agreement that they had with the United States, terms were reset. So deals were struck bilaterally, so to the advantage of both partners. The same was done as far as US imposing tariffs on Chinese goods is concerned. Many of the large multinational corporations in the US lobbied for their own sectors so that tariffs were hiked only on those that were not the most critical, not the most important imported inputs. So one needs to understand that this is a very, very nuanced kind of move that will be made. It's not so simple when you say 10%, 60%, it's going to be some blanket application of 10% and China is going to be a loser. China has many cards up its sleeve, so it's a careful bargaining that's going to be happening between these two who are in a position to compete with each other for a position that I don't think we are in as yet, We have to make space, we have to take advantage of the situation that's being created. But then that's where capability would arise,
Very briefly in 30 seconds, in this scenario, what would an Indian strategy look like?
As I said, I mean, in order to attract investment, you have to be attractive enough in competition with who are your competing economies, Are you comparable to your competing economies in terms of logistics, Yes, you've improved as far as major components of logistics are concerned. Customs procedures, no. We are still not up there, As far as tariffs are concerned, something that one talks about all the time, in competing sectors, you see, where you want to attract, which are the high value sectors, semiconductors, electronics, our tariffs don't compare with tariffs, let's say in Vietnam, Malaysia, which is now coming back to being the electronics value chain hub. So we don't compete as far as tariffs are concerned. We don't compete, or we're not comparable, as far as logistics are concerned, fully so. Other aspects as far as investment is concerned, one has been talking about investment agreements, trade agreements, which is what brings you as a part of, on account of the rules of origin, a part of the value chain. It makes it easier for you to integrate with those value chains. The investment treaty, the provisions that we provide in our bilateral or even much in the international investment agreements or investment chapters and FTAs, not attractive enough for investors to really be looking at us. I mean, you have to see the numbers. I think this year or in 23, 20, 24, 25, we've had the lowest ever foreign direct investment. It's come down to lowest ever in the last 10, 20 years. I think it's the lowest ever in 20 years or so, So why is it that you have foreign direct investment falling as far as India is concerned, Look at ASEAN countries. In the balance as far as the entire ASEAN is ASEAN +3 or Asia, as we say, minus or inclusive of, let's say, China and ASEAN, overall, the FDI has been stable. But between China and ASEAN, the falling levels as far as China are concerned are compensated by increasing investments coming to ASEAN countries. They've been one of the most attractive destinations for foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector, which is what we should be attracting. But as I said, there is competition. You're competing against your neighbors. Are you really prepared to take those steps forward? When Professor Jacob says CPTPP, do we have the capability? That's a way to commit yourself to reforms. Other countries have done that, I mean, when Vietnam signed the FTA with EU, it's not like it had everything in place. But that's how you commit yourself. That's how you politically commit yourself. That's how you have your political constituencies prepare for what is going to happen in the forthcoming years, So FTAs have a purpose in that sense because they help you to commit to economic reforms. They are also signaling mechanisms. I mean, when I say that we should put in our application, if you're able to announce today that we will be putting in our application, that by itself is an indicator or a signal to the rest of the world, foreign investors, yes, we are willing to take up reforms soon. Industry also, by the way, comes around. I don't think industry was in any way, in terms of voices for reform, was in any way prepared for the reforms when they did happen in 1991. You had the Bombay Club at that time, up in arms. So, and industry, not just in India, everywhere else in the world. I mean, I have been told about many, that when Vietnam was going in for its different FTAs, with the developed economies, you had industry go through a very difficult process. But it's a mutual kind of a process, you see, where industry is, yes, opposing, the political goes ahead with it. As it goes ahead with it, the industry comes around. And we know that there will always be winners and losers, in a market system.
Thank you. Shayak, last word for opportunities to you. I was reading one of your recent blogs and where you highlighted that Trump's skepticism towards technologies like EV actually clashes with how much he wants to sort of counter China in these aspects, so potentially enabling cooperation at lower levels of government. So could you highlight for us two target areas where India should look at in this sector in clean energy and technology, given this scenario?
Yeah, I'll highlight two opportunities. I think first broadly is a kind of return or an appreciation to an all of the above approach when it comes to energy. I think too much of the time, especially when kind of Democrats come into power in the United States, there's a tendency to focus on emissions reductions while ignoring very important questions of energy security and ultimately development and economic growth. And I think with this administration coming in, at least there's an understanding that fossil fuels will not be going away, and they will be critical to India's economic growth, at least for several decades. And I'm not trying to throw everyone under the bus in this current Biden administration. There is an understanding, but rhetorically, publicly, they will never, they'll always focus on the clean energy alternatives, which have become competitive thanks to China and a few other countries. But that appreciation of what it means to making sure that per capita energy consumption and economic growth are central in part to how the country uses energy, I think is a welcome change that I see. I think the other thing that we're trying to see is climate, and has always been kind of couched in questions of energy, right? Because that's why we're in this climate crisis. But viewing climate as more of a strategic imperative, and I'm not talking about heat stress and refugees. Of course, that's a very Western way of looking at it. Of the Pentagon will come up with scenarios of what happens when the world gets too warm, and that's a threat, and that's very real. But I think countries are starting to understand that, or at least developed countries, especially the United States, is starting to understand that cooperating with countries like India when it comes to climate is through economic and strategic terms is a much more durable way to find deals, strike cooperation, and actually get anything done, right? Otherwise, I'm of the opinion of you're not going to have reachable finance, especially public US money. However, USDFC, Tino mentioned USDFC, $1 billion, again, in the grand scheme of India's energy transition is not a lot of money, but $1 billion for one single government for single projects and investments in certain sectors is, I think, a welcome sign. And USDFC enjoys Republican support, right? Because it was actually the United States Development Finance Institution was established or reestablished during the first Trump administration. So these kinds of areas where, again, emissions reductions aren't the top line. It's how are we creating economic opportunity, investment, and jobs if it makes sense. I think I highlighted this previously, the risk. Now, is that clean energy and climate cooperation as a strategic imperative? Is that getting lumped in with technology cooperation? Again, technology is a strategic imperative. It has been during the Biden administration, but will that continue during Trump? I don't know yet. Hopefully, but it's still uncertain. But I do think, again, there's an appreciation now that it can't just be business as usual we'll strike deals to reduce emissions, to retire coal power plants, because that approach will never work with India. And, I think you're wasting precious political capital doing that.
The change in narrative is required in terms of how we view these issues.
I mean, it's a little bit of narrative, but again, I think ultimately it boils down to, I'm a bit of a cynic, and where's the money going, right? If you look at the grand, scheme of public climate finance or anything towards the energy sector from the US government, again, USDFC has been the only thing that has had any appreciable amounts, $1 billion. And that approach, I think, is at least tentatively a much more optimistic path forward than, more loans potentially to retire coal power plants, or a few. Again, these are important, they're needed, but given the scale that we need in India, anything less than, several billion is just peanuts. So 50 million for technical assistance, 10 million here, needed, very welcome, but it's not going to move the needle by any means.
All right, thank you. On that note, a lot of risks identified, fewer opportunities. But I open now the floor to audience questions. Please identify yourself. Please let me know who you're posing the question to, and most importantly, keep your questions brief. I will have to cut you off if your questions are not brief. We will take 3 questions at a time. So yes, next.
My name is Mujib. Question for Dr. Jacob and Tino. This tag of the ever giver that was sort of long associated with China, we've sort of seen that challenge recently as well. In Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksas didn't really get much help from China at the end, although it was clear that a collapse of Sri Lanka would reflect on China as well. And in Bangladesh as well, we saw that on her last trip to China, Sheikh Hasina really didn't get what she wanted, although she had sort of skillfully balanced India and China. So in this new space that we're entering, what is your assessment? Does China still want to play that role of a lender? Has that changed, whether it's domestic or sort of decisions it's made, or it still has that muscle to flex in this new reality?
Thank you. There was one behind.
I'm Madhu from the High Commission of Canada. I have a question on an issue that has actually not been discussed here at all, so I hope I'm not going out of line. It's for Constantino. Does the Indian government have any uncertainties about, India is trying to emerge as a mediator in the Ukraine situation? So does India anticipate any uncertainties with the new Trump administration? Because there have been a lot of discussions between officials of both countries, especially the recent visit of the US NSA, and Ukraine and Gaza and Israel were also discussed.
Thank
So-
you.
Thank you.
Anita.
Thank you, Riya. So this question is for Constantino as well. You mentioned that the United States will be disengaging from the Indo-Pacific, and you see a greater, you see an opportunity for India to engage with Japan, the EU, and France as the Trump administration disengages from the collective security architecture. So in what ways, like you mentioned, maritime security, but are there any specific areas that you think would be where we could see more cooperation, perhaps? Like you could please elaborate on that. Thank you.
Let us take one more question, sir.
Good evening. My name is Pawan. My question is related to the discussion which we had so far. Nobody has given a thought regarding the US relationship with Pakistan and the triangle which it makes with China and India's role in that. What opportunity India is having, what challenges you are having. Just one, in fact, instance, recently there are confirmed reports that Pakistan has occupied the Wakhan corridor, giving it direct access to the Tajikistan and huge fields of energy. How does it impact us, and what is in fact the role India can play? Thank you.
Professor Jacob, we'll start with you. The first
Yeah.
question.
Okay, so to Mujib's question, I think it's not correct to say that China was an ever giver in the past. I mean, it has always been this way, which is it went in, and it's partly narrative that it is, and it's also by default. When the Europeans and the Americans are stingy or do not pay attention to the rest of the world, then China has a say, has a visibility by default. But it has never been the case that it simply opened its purse strings without conditions attached. I think that was always the case. And in many instances, countries or governments are quite happy to give in to Chinese conditions because they said, okay, I will still support this level, but not to the American level or the European level. There was that.
Or Indian.
Or the Indian level, yes. Let's be equal opportunity offenders. And look, if in Sri Lanka, the case of China standing in the way of debt restructuring was talked about. But look, if you've lost your guy in power and everybody else is now getting involved, why should the Chinese make it easier for everybody else, right? It's what are they getting out of it? So in fact, it also reinforces a picture that, look, if you're with us, no matter what, we will somehow stay with you. And this is the case broadly with Pakistan. While there are tensions in the China-Pakistan relationship, the Chinese are still continuing to sort of be on the side of the Pakistanis, keep the Pakistanis interested. Though, of course, the complications in the China-Pakistan relationship because of CPEC, that's another story. But I think China has never been completely free with its finances. It's always imposed conditions. And really it's on scholars, other countries, the United States, India, to make this point of view clearer to other countries who might be tempted by Chinese finances. That look, this is not a free lunch. There are costs to this. And it's up to you whether or not you want to pay the cost now or later. So China still has a muscle, by the way. If China thinks that there is an advantage, there is a vote in the UN to be swung, or there is a way in which the Americans can be kept out of Afghanistan or Pakistan, the Chinese will do and flex that muscle. The Chinese are involved in helping the Taliban, for example. So yeah, on the US, China, Pakistan, look, I mean, if I might just quickly add to that, really the onus is on India. I mean, if India will have a confrontational relationship and with one country, then other countries are going to go in and step in and take advantage. So if you can't fix your relationship with Pakistan, the Chinese will take advantage. The Americans will take advantage. Why should anybody make it easier for us? That's not the way international politics functions. So can we think out of the box and do something different with the Pakistanis? Then we'll see. Then you'll see the Chinese scampering. Then you'll see the Americans scampering. Yeah.
Thank you. Tino, 2 questions on the uncertainties as a mediator in Ukraine war and the specific areas of cooperation.
Yeah, I think what Jabin mentioned, it's not about what China is or isn't. We all have no illusions about what China does or doesn't and how everyone is sort of a normal state, frankly, including India. The problem is the narrative and the image of China. And again, the studies at least that I've done, the people I meet in Kathmandu, Colombo, and Dhaka, the paper I did, for example, how the Quad is perceived by elites in these countries is a negative. And even the most glaring, interest-driven Chinese initiatives are embraced as positive, as understandable, etc., by these countries. Now, obviously, that is shifting, Mujib. I think there is a learning process. I remember going to Kathmandu and Dhaka and telling people in 16, 17, listen, China's a normal state. It has interests, there are conditions, there are strings attached. I think that's what all of us scholars have been telling these countries. But you can't blame them, right? China was giving more than any other partner had given, with different type of strings. So it was an illusion of newness that China was going to help. I think that is, you're rightly saying, shifting, but it still poses a huge burden on India. That is my main point. And as the US is under Trump is expected to support and work less with India on that, right? And it's going to retrench from that. It's not that it's disappearing. I'm sure State Department, Energy Department, Commerce Department, all these, the bureaucracy of the US will still have a lag and a path dependence to do some things with India. We had Jake Sullivan here, the NSA, announcing, right, that a lot Biden did will continue. And again, to what Jabin said, what had been done in the Trump one, continuing to Biden, there's a lot of continuities there. But there will be a relative falling back. And that puts a burden on India then. Then if you can't even do simple electricity, transportation projects with your neighbors because of political considerations, and you can't just blame the Chinese for playing operations in the background to undermine Indian projects because these countries have sensitivities and are worried and are still enamored, if I may use that, with China. That is a reality and we have to deal with that, which means, again, more narrative building, more delivery, more negotiation with these countries, but certainly with less US support. And certainly, I don't think under Trump, we would see $550 million of US taxpayers' money, public, going into Nepal for an MCC project with India. DFC, to Shayak's point, maybe we'll see, because that's a private sector element to the Sri Lankan port. But then we have, again, the Adani problem in that container terminal, which is, again, opening up issues there. But there will be more of that private sector mobilization. Second point is on the US-India partnership. I think, see, we have to look at this at sea lines of communication, digital public infrastructure, health, energy and climate, how these countries have developed an architecture, India and the US, to provide public goods to the global south, for example, Africa, neighboring countries, the larger Indian periphery. That again will slow down, and that leads me to the point about the middle powers that was asked. The burden will fall much more on the EU and India doing this, on France and India doing this and securing the sea lines of communication that trade can flow freely. It's not just about the trade agreements, it's about the sea lines of communication that have to be secured for those ships to pass through, which means, again, what is the UNCLOS approach that India has and China has, and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, Indonesia and Thailand, both Indian maritime neighbors. If you can't control that and shape that regulatory environment on sea lines of communication, right, it'll be very difficult. The US will do less of it. My point is Japan, Australia, ASEAN, Indonesia, European Union, UK, France, all these middle powers will do more of it, as we saw between 16 and 20. That will see a revival, which is paradoxical, because many of these countries will come under pressure from the Americans. The Japanese will start having to look inwards, East Asia wards, and protect their own security with the Chinese, Taiwan, etc. But they will also mobilize, and that's my assessment under Trump, that will create synergies with Delhi, Tokyo, Delhi, Canberra, Delhi, Paris, Delhi, on shaping the Indo-Pacific they want. And the last point is only on the Ukraine. The last thing Trump needs, if he does a deal with the Russians, is to give the credit to Prime Minister Modi. President Biden may have needed that, which is why we heard a lot of this noise, right? Because the Americans pushed one line to make peace with the Russians. You needed someone to maybe say, I did this, which India would have done, right? Whether it's by passing a message or a cable or flying into one capital or the other. I don't think Trump will have any incentive to that, so that's off the card. So India has done mediation, by the way, unless what I'm hearing a lot in this town, India mediated in the Suez crisis, in Hungary, in Korea. I can give you 10 examples in the neighborhood, whether it's in the Chakma Hill tribes, in Nepal, including the regime change, in Sri Lanka, in Thimphu talks in 1983-86. India has a long tradition of mediation, but it was not bound to do anything between the West and Russia. And under Trump, it'll have even less. Trump will have literally no interest to give that credit away to Delhi.
Thank you. Next round of questions. Sir, you had your hand up.
My name is Ravi Bothalingam. This question is for you, Jabin. Now, China has had a tradition of playing the long game. During Deng's years, it was said, hide your light under a bushel and so on. Right? She, of course, has had a different philosophy. But right now, with the Trump threat and the prospect that the Trump era might last only 4 years, unless he does something drastic, might not China again decide, let's put our light, if not under a bushel, dim it slightly, play soft, strike a deal, promise to invest in America, don't have all this rhetoric on critical minerals, just cool it for a while. We will resume the march with full capability afterwards, which is what they've done several times in their history. And Trump can get away with saying, well, I struck the deal of all time. Is that a possibility?
Thank you. Ravi.
Yeah. Summer from DSE. My question to Jacob sir. How much this assertion is true about Trump that which goes as per madman theory that behaves so irrationally that everybody else start behaving in a rational way. So does this carry any kind of weight about Trump's personality, which is a more kind of a theoretical question?
Hey, so this is a question for either Tino or Jabin and that you decide, and then also for Amita. When one neighbor after another, the points that you were making has a problem of some type, then it seems to have been happening for many, many decades. You may have had some correction in recent years, with perhaps Sri Lanka and perhaps Maldives, I don't know. So there seems to be something systemically wrong with our foreign policy establishment. And it takes a long time to correct systemic problems. Is there something there or is there something else? So just your guesses on that. Amita, on the neighborhoods, on all the countries, we seem to, I think, have a trade surplus with almost all our neighboring countries. It's minor, but with Bangladesh, it's a lot. With Bhutan, maybe an exception. Okay, fine. What has prevented India from reversing this? Why can't we be importing much more from our neighbors? Is it just pure petty local politics or there's something else to it?
Thank you.
Hi,
Okay, sorry. Yes.
is it? Yeah. My question is to Shayak sir and Amita ma'am. Like EU has implemented the CBAM, and if that works well with India and like the tariffs work well, will Trump catch on to the trend and will the world move towards carbon taxes? And if yes, what should India do? What is the first move? Can India have some first movers advantage in that respect? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so for this round, Shayak, let's start with you.
Sure. So, I mean, carbon tariffs are now kind of in vogue, especially for developed economies. The United States Congress, everyone kind of in Washington expects the US to have some kind of carbon tariff in the next few years. There are two bills, one from Democrats, one from Republicans. There's also there are 2 to 3 bills floating around in Congress that couch it in terms of a foreign pollution fee, sticking it to China, all well and done. The issue is, I'm not a big fan of EU CBAM, but at least you can conceptually agree because they have a domestic carbon price. The United States will not have a domestic carbon price anytime soon. So ultimately, the US likely will have one of these, and they haven't really given really good answers for developing countries who said, first of all, even if we have firms who are able to, adopt technologies and reduce their emissions, are you going to give us any credit? They'll say, oh, we'll earmark some of the revenues from this tariff for some fund that we will decide what to do with. That being said, again, if we were to kind of look at the crystal ball, Trump is a fan of tariffs, and you could conceivably sign on to this if it's again couched in language that is used as a way of America first. So, I think for India that's an issue, right? Because the US is the largest trading partner, and India exports a great deal. And I remember looking at this; it's diamonds. That's the first in terms of value. But after you put aside diamonds, which can be carbon intensive, I think it's going to be an issue. And I think you're starting to see that again with the CBAM with some of these negotiations. But I think the United States, some of these trade tensions, it's unclear to me whether they're prepared to deal with them. I conceivably they are, but in a way that will be amenable to how Trump works. I don't know.
Thank you.
On CBAM, almost all countries, certainly all developed countries, are working on something similar to CBAM as a carbon border tax, So that carbon border tax is going to be around. As far as India is concerned, we need to get prepared to make our manufacturing sector more green to be able to export more, under these new circumstances, The second question, in terms of the balance, as far as trade balance, as far as smaller economies in the region are concerned, yes, true, there's always been a deficit as far as the smaller economies are concerned vis-a-vis India, except for a short exceptional period in case of Nepal, as well as Bhutan. I think Nepal was closer to 2099, 2000 or sometime, what can be, one, yes, always a deficit. Two, this deficit may not be as large as formal trade indicates, because there's a lot of informal trade that's happening between these countries, given the porosity of borders, you see, Nepal, Bangladesh, etc. Informal trade as far as India, Pakistan is concerned, third country trade, circular trade, so lots of trade happens otherwise. That's not necessarily accounted for. But that apart, the pure economic argument is they don't have the same kind of manufacturing base as we do for us to be able to import enough to compensate as far as that deficit is concerned. We are more capable, we've had a more developed industrial base, manufacturing sector, etc., compared to any of these. They don't even have the resources or the comparative advantage to have similar kind of ability to be able to produce, to export more to India. There can be a compensatory flow of investments, capital, etc. Lots of political economy aspects to that, Apart from that, yes, there is also a certain, we have given, by the way, duty-free, quota-free access to all least developed countries in the region, so that they export this, that covers about 90% of their exports, So we make it easy for them as far as tariffs are concerned. We don't impose on all these commodities. But there is also the other side where some non-tariff barriers are imposed, which may have a political economy argument to them, but could also be purely standards that we could be imposing or implementing, where they don't necessarily qualify or conform to those standards that we import, So that's there is a political economy argument to this, but purely on economic terms, it's very hard to imagine that they will be able to have a surplus vis-a-vis India.
On Lavish's related question, Tino, on the Indian foreign policy, do you want to address that?
Yeah, systemic challenge, Lavish. Everything's a systemic challenge, I feel, around public policy, neighborhood, US, relations with China. But I'd say in a very simplistic way, Lavish, I think that the problem is that you are 50 years late on understanding what the Chinese understood in 1978, what the US understood post-World War II, what Europe engaged post-World War II, which was economic interdependence is a must. It has to be managed. And for that, you need whether trade or infrastructure, interlinkages with other countries. And I'm saying 50 years late because, frankly, if you ask me what is the origin of that interdependence, economic interdependence, other types of interdependence we're thinking in the Indian system, it's late 90s, right? In line with the reforms that begin in 91. So that's when India started looking at its periphery, forget South Asia, but ASEAN also in a very different way, right? When it started looking at Southeast Asia as a growth area that would benefit India. That's the beginning of India's Look East policy in the 90s. So it's 50 years late, or compared to China, what, 25, 15, 20 years almost, because frankly, the Chinese, a communist one-party state decided that it was in its strategic interest to embrace the capitalist market economy in a Chinese way to make benefits out of it. I think in the Indian system, we're running very late on that. There's great progress over the last 25 years now, but very slow. If you do not have a single railway link connecting you to Kathmandu, altitude, 1,500 meters above sea level, and the Chinese are building high-speed railways into Tibet, right, at 4,000 meters. It tells you about the gaps and the lack there. I think it's quite clear today that India wants to do this, and more important to the point about the US, which we're discussing here today. Today, I think everyone in the Indian system realizes that they need to work together with the US in the periphery. Sometimes you will disagree, Bangladesh, for example, on what the politics should be in those countries. But I think everyone in your system realizes today that you need, again, I mentioned the Nepal and Sri Lanka example, finance, support, political investments. It's good to have the US around in its periphery, most of the times. That was not the case 20 years ago. Much more open, competitive region where you work with the Japanese in Bangladesh, where you work again with the Americans, etc. And that's why I'm just coming back to the main mantra today is I think as the US will become more cynical about this under Trump, it will put a greater burden on India to shape its periphery and to keep that engine running of interdependence with South Asia, Indian Ocean region, by the way, the Gulf and the IMEC, and the Eastern variant, which is with Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, for the supply chains that, for example, our Japanese friends wish to connect India with.
Can I add a point here? On this, I mean, interdependence here, that's, but as we say, as far as South Asia is concerned, it's sui generis, it's a very different case from any other region. So interdependence that's worked in ASEAN, in EU, it's all very different. You can't forget, as far as South Asia is concerned, geographically, economically, the largeness of India, and hence the complexities that arise out of variation in size, economic as well as geographical, India has common borders with all South Asian countries. They do not share borders with each other. India therefore becomes a transit across. Three countries being born out of one. There is historical baggage here, Pakistan, Bangladesh. You can't forget these things, So interdependence, yes, works theoretically. It has worked in other regions, but to think that will work to the same extent where you've had these border conflicts, identity crises, identity conflicts, you have spillovers as far as cultures are concerned, more as far as regions are concerned, commonalities between East and other countries within the region, more so than East and South, North and South. South has more with Sri Lanka probably. You will have, these secessionist movements that we've had earlier, So all of this basically tells you that South Asia is a very, very different historical context, you see, and that has carried through over the years for interdependence, even if we've tried to do that, proving to be very difficult. Textiles and apparel is one sector where it's a possibility because we have that kind of comparative advantage across. We have each of these countries doing well in textiles and apparel, but we are unable to do that value chain, supply chain or value chain integration with it, Bangladesh will import from Korea, Bangladesh will import from Hong Kong, China, etc. But the imports don't happen from India. There are political reasons for that. So there's a lot of political economy that comes in the way of trade as it can potentially be in the region, but is not and is hard to actually accomplish in comparison with many other regions, or with most other regions.
Professor Jacob.
Okay, let me take the madman question first. There's two problems with this, if you call it a theory or this theory. One, who is a madman? Today's madman is tomorrow's great statesman, right? Genius. So if Hitler had won the war, nobody would have called him a madman. And you watch a fantastic Netflix serial called The Man in the High Castle. If anyone's seen it, highly recommended. The other is unlike a business environment where you can play a game of chicken or whatever, in international politics there are many madmen, right? So I'm not entirely certain that this particular theory or this particular idea really is of much value from an analytical point of view. To come to Mr. Buthalingam's point about China playing the long game, first and foremost, we should understand that the long game by itself is not a good thing. Often countries, again, it's like with the benefit of hindsight, you can say this is a long game, but at that point in time or for quite a bit of time, countries are playing the long game because they're clueless. They don't know what they want to do or what they have to do, or they don't have the capacity. Now, in China's case, they gave up this 24-character strategy of biding your time, hiding your capacity some time ago. Even in Hu Jintao's time, the 24 characters was modified to a 28-character strategy, which said also achieve something, right? So, and with Xi Jinping, it's all the more necessary. He's made it, Chinese foreign policy or China's future about actually also responding in quick time or in immediate time to show that China doesn't simply wait and absorb, but China is also proactive. So to answer your question, yes, China will do a bit of waiting and watching, but Xi Jinping will also be constrained to respond because that's a narrative that is built up at home, saying, well, China is going to stand toe to toe with the Americans. They can't simply be absorbing what the Americans are going to throw at them. And with Trump 2.0, the Chinese are much better prepared than they were in the first administration. They have counters to potential tariff plans. And as we've all been talking, the Chinese Chinese control supply chains in critical minerals. And they are going to tighten the screws on graphite and other elements, critical minerals, as we have already been seeing. So I don't think Trump 2.0 or anybody else for that matter will find it so easy. The Chinese will respond. They will respond in kind, even if they will take some damage in the process. I mean, the Americans say, that Trump's tariff wars are bad for America. America has lost $1 billion plus in trade. They've lost jobs, everything. The Chinese are willing to take that. In fact, you see that happening right now in China. Chinese are willing to absorb a lot of pain in order to achieve what Xi Jinping thinks is this notional good or greatness for China.
Taiwan, talking of pain.
I think Taiwan is overblown. Don't let the Americans tell you that's going to happen. That's my assessment.
That's what they think.
That's what they like us to believe.
Excellent. On that note, we want to do more? Can we, if the panelists and audience are okay with it? Okay, we can take it 3 more questions. So I'm sorry, you've been waiting. So
Hi, Billy. Thanks. I'm Venkat from PAR, Seattle-based not-for-profit, and I'm going to kind of change the question from economic issues a little bit to the social development issues. And I was thinking who to ask the question to, and you said those magic words G20 and Global South. So I'm going to kind of give that question to you. So we are acutely aware of the fact that with the new administration coming in, there would be a shift in how US has been shaping the global social development agenda. They've been doing it for the last 70 years, but we are aware that a lot of investments that they've been making into the social development issues is going to be pulled back, which means there's going to be a vacuum created. So one part of my question is, who are the critical players you see filling in that gap? Second is, after 4 years of G20 presidency with the Global South, 2026, the presidency moves to the US. How would the G20 narrative and the deliberations be shaping under the US presidency of the G20? Because that's one of the platforms outside the UN system where the Global North and the Global South interact and shape the global policies. So those are the 2 questions to you. Thank you.
thank you.
Hi,
Last 2 questions, and then Veda.
My question is for ma'am. Post the 2008 GFC, American politics and political economy has increasingly started becoming inward looking, and hence the rise of Trump or even the new Washington consensus that Jack Sullivan talked about in terms of bringing back onshoring and creating new middle class jobs for working American class. So is there not enough adequate recognition or appreciation in the rest of the world, developing countries and other countries, about this fundamental change that has happened in American politics and political economy in the last 15 years? Thanks.
Veda.
My question is for Jabin. You quickly mentioned that we need to keep an eye out for top picks in his cabinet, in Trump's cabinet. So in terms of nominees, I was wondering what you make of Marco Rubio, whose confirmation hearing, if I'm not mistaken, is in a few hours today, who has said scandalously crazy things about China. How is that going to shape Trump 2.0 China strategy?
India.
Yeah. Thanks. All right, thank you. If I can request the panelists to be brief with their remarks. Professor Jacob, can we start with you?
Yeah, look, politicians everywhere say scandalously dangerous or scandalous stuff on the campaign trail. But I think power and bureaucrats surrounding them is a very sobering, has a very sobering effect. But like I mentioned at the beginning, I think one consequence of this being a Trump party of intense loyalty to the dear leader or the great leader, I think it will have consequences for policy making. And smart policy can shift, bad policy can change overnight. And that's an uncertainty that we will have to sort of deal with. And it might not necessarily always be a bad thing for India, and it might not necessarily be a bad thing for China also, of course. So I think we'll have to wait and watch, right? That's my answer.
Thank you, Professor Batra.
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question, but when you say the bring back jobs to America, yes, it started way back post GFC. The first time, I think, when we had Obama here, there was this entire crowd saying, bring back jobs to America, So much in terms of populism has shaped, all of this that's being done, in terms of onshoring, hiking tariffs, saying we are bringing back industry is all being done in response to that populist narrative, and there is recognition of that, but I'm not sure what you mean by developing. He carried on with the same. He dare not, because it has a political constituency, so he dare not deviate.
Trump is dramatically different. The
Trump,
impulses and the narratives may be very sharp at the edges.
Trump is he's unpredictable.
Yeah, sure.
Not so as far as Biden is concerned. There is a certain method to what Biden is doing, But as far as protectionism, inward looking, that is expected, in this day and age. They are doing it. But I do again pose that, how far can they do it is, and as a transactional approach, yes, you can use that as an instrument, But how far can you really uproot those supply chains and bring them back to the US? That's not possible to do. You may be thinking of fresh investments elsewhere. Apple is doing in India, et cetera, but you can't think of uprooting the complete system, and rebuilding it in the US.
And the last word to Tino.
Yeah, I think Riya, on the first point that, I was reminded when Jake Sullivan came the earliest month, the NSA, he reminded us of the 1-2-3 deal that the US and India struck between late Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and at the point President Bush Jr. And he said that this was, I was looking up, not a natural occurrence. He said it was a politically driven initiative with a vision for the country. And I remind ourselves of that because it tells us that sometimes, like Jabin was hinting, we call political leaders madmen and crazy and erratic and unpredictable. But we will see a world under Trump, and I've seen a world worldwide, by the way, of leaders that have going with their political instinct and are taking certain bets in line with business, less the bureaucracy. Good, bad, we can discuss. I'm just giving the 1-2-3 deal because it was actually very good for US-India relations. And if those two political leaders had not had the vision, this is beautiful dinner in the White House in 2008, where they're all sitting together around the table, 6 people, both the Prime Minister and the President, and someone, I think it's from the Indian side, says, it's Condi Rice, the NSA, who tells Bush, oh great, to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, great, so now we'll have a lot of nuclear energy cooperation between both countries. And Bush interrupts and says, no, you didn't get the point. This is everything except nuclear energy cooperation. And here we are in 2024, right? And the benefits of that relation, of that vision that those political statesmen had, it would never have reached that point if it would have been left up to the bureaucracy. So with all due respect to the bureaucracy, it implemented and negotiated the deal between 2005 and 2008, but it was a political vision, however mad it was. And believe me, in Washington, D.C., people thought this was crazy to do a nuclear deal, which was undermining 50 years of a global multilateral nuclear non-proliferation regime with India, right? So just that's point number one. Point number two is on your point. I'm very happy you asked, because you'll see my answer implied in what I said on the infrastructure neighborhood business between the model of USAID, MCC, and DFC. And that leads to the point that we'll see a lot of continuity, but less of public finance and more private sector. So for example, I expect Trump to still, so your answer allows me to qualify my point. It will be certain US retrenchment, but it will be a different US that will show up to do the same things. For example, the work we're doing on triangular development cooperation for the Global South that Pooja is leading here, my colleague. I think infrastructure that Riya is doing, for example. 2 examples of the US and India have been doing this through public instruments and are pivoting towards private, DFC Sri Lanka, for example. And I think, Shayak, you mentioned again, it was a Trump architecture, that's a Trump 1 architecture that created the consolidated DFC that existed in various parts in the US government. So we'll see instead, for example, on triangular, on tech, health, I will watch out for health, pharma, technology, energy and climate, of course. So that's also a story that tells you it will not be the end of the US-India energy climate, because there will be private sector interest in providing to the Global South solutions, and infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. These will be 4 areas which I expect even a Trump 2 administration to work closely with India for profit-making interests in the US to go abroad and work with India to scale up developmental solutions, our beautiful old liberal language, but in his case, profit-making initiatives for US India, also for the Indian companies, therefore. So we'll see a lot more of that, but driven by the private sector. That's my guess.
Also very briefly on the G20.
I think all these names, I was looking at it, ICET, Global Biofuels Alliance, Digital Development Partnership, all US India, I2U2, IMEC, Mineral Security Partnership. All these things will be erased from the nomenclature of US government, but they will continue in substance mostly. So call them whatever you want. Some of the Biden administration just stamped letters on things that Trump initiated. Now he will erase those letters and do a lot of the same thing. And then we'll have another, not a Biden, but another president made from the Democratic Party, which will then add new letters to it.
On that final note, and thank you for bearing with us. We've covered a lot of ground today, so please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. Also, thank you to the foreign policy team, Pooja, Anika, Sukrit for helping us organize this today, to our events team and communications team. Thank you very much.